Thank you for joining us. This is the SNA Speakeasy. I believe our number 13 SNA Speakeasy, so you got the lucky number today. Uh, and our topic today is about crisis communications. And this is, of course, a time of crisis, so we definitely want to be hearing about that subject. Our guest today is David Wagner, and I'll let you kind of explain to the audience who it is, who you are, and what your background is in this field.
Okay, so thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. So I'm a media and crisis trainer and simulator and also business strategist. I help organizations, public and private sector organizations, to analyze what they're doing with the media, look at their messaging, help their spokespersons deliver what they're doing, as well as do crisis simulations to make sure the teams are operating at their optimum. I've been doing this for about well over 20 years now. I worked a lot of my time inside different agencies here in Japan, running crisis teams and running media teams to go into companies and do these kinds of simulations. And I have been out on my own for 6, 7 years from the agencies doing this on my own. And that's my introduction.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, are you getting a tsunami of new sort of inquiries since the COVID-19 crisis began?
Yeah, I think we have to define what tsunami is, but there are a lot of companies that need help. It strikes me that the bigger ones tend to have their own internal operations, their own PR teams that are doing it for them. Even they are sometimes overloaded and they need help. But the SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, usually don't have internal capability to do it on their own, and they outsource.
Okay, so let's get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts. What more practically is it that crisis communications involves? I mean, how should we define the term? I guess would be a good way to start.
Well, I would throw the question back and ask the question to you. When does a problem become a crisis, Michael? What's the difference between a problem and a crisis?
I guess when you get panicked.
Yeah, panic is not part of either, I don't think. But basically, a problem becomes a crisis when the media gets involved. And the media gets involved because something has been leaked, either intentionally or unintentionally, to the media. And I think the challenge we live in right now is that we have 7+ billion people on the earth, and almost all of them have a cell phone. That makes all of them a potential journalist. And when you have an internal problem, for example, sexual harassment inside a company, as soon as that gets tweeted out or Facebooked out or YouTubed out or whatever the medium, it becomes an external problem. And that's what really helps us define what a crisis is. So the likelihood of also media attention can be considered a crisis. And the actual or potential problems become a crisis from the moment the media announces their existence. So media treatment then determines to the large extent what the impact of the crisis will be.
Well, I feel kind of flattered as a media person to be considered a crisis as soon as my attention is on a subject or on a company.
Well, look, I mean, I always tell people journalists are not your friends and they're not your enemies. But,
Exactly.
a journalist is trying to make a different kind of headline than most organizations are. Journalist is, for lack of a better word, trying to sensationalize things to sell their newspapers or whatever they're selling. And I think what organizations want to do is maintain their reputation. And so sometimes you have to get your radar up and make sure that you're doing what you need to do to make sure your messages get out. So again, I don't say don't trust journalists. I just say journalists have a different modus operandi.
Hmm. And a different agenda, it sounds.
Yeah, and a lot of them do. The thing is, it all comes down, as with anything, to your relationship with the journalist. I think a lot of PR companies and PR teams inside organizations know all the journalists in town. They know who to stay away from. They know the ones that are safe and trusted. If you've been with a journalist drinking and to dinner with them for 10 years and you have some semblance of trust, that's one thing. But there's also the reality. Whatever you say can be used in the court against you. So if you say it, it's too late, and therefore you got to be strategic.
And what kind of organizations are we talking about that you would mainly deal with? Would these be public or private organizations?
Everything.
Is there some sort of everything? Okay, well, I guess that's the answer.
Well, I'll give you an example. So speaking of crisis, the biggest crisis to hit Japan in the last decade was, of course, Fukushima. And during the Fukushima crisis, I volunteered to work inside the Prime Minister's office with their communications team to help them make sure their spokespersons were delivering at optimum level. And I did that for 3 weeks. That was, by the way, volunteer. As a give back to Japan, I wanted to do that and help them out, just like I'm doing a lot of volunteer work now. So I think what's important is to make sure not only that you've got the right messages, but you've got the right spokespersons, and those spokespersons are delivering the way they should be. There's all kinds of considerations. There's verbal and visual, there's articulatability, there's the ability to be believable and trustworthy. Because I think in a crisis, what you want is to have trust and believability. I made to add also to that transparency. Yeah.
So, what would be sort of the difference between this sort of crisis communications, or is there a difference between crisis communications in say, ordinary times, say last year, and in a situation where today, where the crisis is become sort of global? You mentioned that you had experience in Fukushima, and in a sense that was a global crisis as far as Japan was concerned. So is there a major distinction that should be made between these two contexts?
Well, I think the main difference is a lot of media that companies do is to promote products and services in normal times. You know, a soda company has a new soda they want to promote, then you have a spokesperson to do it. There's very little threat going on to the organization at that point. I think when we look at some potential crisis situations, any organization that's involved with products, or if they get engaged in a natural disaster or financial problems, hostile takeover or fraud, labor disputes, management removal, litigation, all of these things help change what is a simple problem and could potentially turn it into a crisis. And we look at high-risk industries like manufacturing, transportation, commodities, food, medical, pharmaceutical, lodging, construction. These are all products and services that can kill if something goes wrong. And companies have to be prepared. Organizations have to be prepared. Every organization can have a sexual harassment lawsuit, large or small. All it takes is one male or female to say they were harassed and tweet it out, and you've got a problem.
So I imagine that there are some very common mistakes that companies or organizations make, which means that they need a guy like you to come in to make them avoid not making those mistakes. What would be some of the major mistakes that you see most often?
Well, let me give you an example. Rather than say most often, because every crisis is unique, I would look at one of the famous ones that happened about 20 years ago. If you remember, the milk company called Snow Brand Milk Products. In 2000, 20 years ago, they had a food poisoning problem and 14,000 people became ill. I'm not sure if you remember that, Michael.
Actually, I was here for that, yeah.
Okay, so if you go back to that and take a look at it, mid-level executives were afraid to share information with top-level executives. They provided media with inaccurate information, and they covered up facts and resisted a product recall. They appeared more concerned with the reputation and status of their own organization than the people who had been poisoned. The president had the wrong messaging, and they had a second scandal within a year that was a beef mislabeling problem. And that led to the dissolution of the entire brand. So, you know, there's examples of that in every country. But even if we go back to Fukushima, Fukushima was a big problem for the government and for Tokyo Electric Power, right? I mean, they lied about the level of damage. They hid the facts from the public for a number of months. And there was incalculable damage to the government's reputation, policymakers, and Tokyo Electric Power, which some would argue has not recovered to this day. So it's pretty clear organizations need to be prepared for any kind of crisis. I mean, look at Fukushima. It's fascinating, right? You had 6 nuclear plants located on an active earthquake fault. How did that happen? How did you put the backup generators for the plant in the basement, which could be flooded by a tsunami? I mean, who thinks of these things? But they knew they were in danger. They knew there was potential for problem, but I think they thought it would never happen. And this is a common characteristic for crisis management. You got to think about the unthinkable. How many companies out there have thought about a pandemic? Not many. Not many. I think large insurance companies have, reinsurance companies probably have, governments probably have, but mom and pop SME down the street, no way, no way. It's not on their radar.
So it sounds like one of the cardinal mistakes is to communicate in a way that undermines your own credibility, or to make yourself appear to be dishonest, or to put out information which is disproven shortly after you put it out there. I mean, these seem to be some of the big mistakes that some of these organizations make.
Yeah, some do, and I think the biggest mistake is to lie. Lying is a bad strategy. It is a strategy. It's a bad one. I never advise it. I think you've got to be transparent, tell the truth.
Well, could you give us an example of that, taking a weakness or a mistake and sort of playing judo on it and making it something good?
Yeah, I can. If we go back 35 years to 1985, you remember the Japan Airlines crash that killed 520 people. It was among the worst airline disasters in the world, and certainly the worst in Japan. But I applaud JAL for the way they handled it. The president apologized at a memorial service and accepted responsibility. He offered to resign in line with Japanese culture. They were quick to notify victims and families. They were quick to make financial reparations. All advertising was suspended. Employees accompanied and helped bereaved families, in all ways, including funerals, attending funerals with them. It was a culture-driven response that was humane and caring and responsible. And, obviously in the beginning, JAL lost market share, but eventually they made a full recovery. That's an example of what I would call a very good crisis. There are others that are good and bad outside of Japan too. I mean, if you look at Johnson & Johnson 1982, the Tylenol cyanide contamination case, that's a long time ago. You'll remember that that's when somebody had placed poison inside the containers of the Tylenol. And what happened was there was a quick recall and a transparent response, which led to moving Johnson & Johnson from a crisis victim to a product safety champion by putting those safety locks on the top of those plastic bottles. So that's an example of turning a bad situation into a win. And then, of course, there's Air France in 2000, which had that crash, a terrible crash, which ultimately led, it was a crash of the Concorde, which led to the end of the Concorde. But I think the reputational damage did not linger with Air France as a whole. So there are lots of examples. I mean, there's some bad examples. ExxonMobil, 1989, with the Exxon Valdez oil spill, they paid the price for decades for perceived slow response. Perrier, 1990, had the benzene contamination. They never recovered market share, and they were swallowed up by. I don't know if you remember this one in the States. Wendy's, 2005, the human finger in the chili incident. You remember that one, Michael?
I recently was reminded of it when I was doing some research on Wendy's.
Yeah, so I don't know who these people were, but they took a real piece of a human finger, put it in their chili, and while they're eating their chili, they discovered this. And through research, it was found out that it was a human finger, but it was nobody that anybody knew in the production process. Somebody had taken an actual finger and put it in there. The way they knew it was a scam was that the finger wasn't cooked. Wendy's delayed their response, and it cost them a lot of money in sales and brand damage. But Wendy's is still around.
So, are there any characteristics of companies that, I mean, you mentioned that many of the biggest companies have their in-house sort of staff which is already tasked with crisis management, whereas others will go to outside contractors like yourself. Is there any characteristic in either or both of these organizations of those which tend to listen to their crisis managing team and those who don't? I mean, I imagine that there must be many cases where you have people inside who are telling them, don't lie, be transparent, make sure that maintain your credibility, and yet they still go out and blow it. How do you see that working out? Which companies basically do that better and which don't?
No, you can't answer the question. And actually, to be honest, I work with professional organizations. I have never seen a spokesperson I've worked with, or any organization I've worked with, put a spokesperson out there that makes a big mistake and is not the right spokesperson. I mean, we've got to look at what makes a right spokesperson. It's not just the title. Just because you're president doesn't mean you're a good spokesperson. And sometimes I'll do simulations with executive teams, for half a day or a day, and they may have one or two designated spokespersons on the executive team, but sometimes I'll find a sleeper, like the head of HR, for example. This woman who's sitting there, and she ends up doing part of the simulation as a spokesperson, and she turns out to be the best speaker of the team. So you just can't tell who's the best spokesperson for the organization until you really test them. But I think the question also is, why don't more companies prepare in general? I think that's your general question. And there's a tendency to treat low probability events as though they're impossible, like pandemic, or unrealistic optimism among successful executives, or threats to reputation are often ignored and sometimes underestimated as a whole. So there are lots of reasons for that. But I think there's common good business sense that can be done to make sure that companies and organizations are prepared. And it starts with things like vulnerability assessments, readiness assessments, crisis response procedures and manuals, making sure that there's an issues monitoring capability, and ultimately, in the business I'm in, make sure everybody's trained. I do sometimes with organizations, I'm training their teams a couple times a year. Make sure they know how to use the manual, make sure they know what to do. They can strategize quickly. They can come up with action plans. They can create their own messaging. They can modify as the situation modifies. That takes practice. It's like a game of golf. You can't just do it once a year and think you're going to be very good at it.
Okay, that makes sense. Practice makes perfect. So before we move into the Q&A section and allow our audience to ask questions, is there anything that I haven't asked you about, but which a point you want to make sure is out there during the course of this event?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things to talk about. I think the most important thing I will reiterate, as I've said, is you've got to have a believable and a trusted spokesperson that represents the organization with the right messages. And if it's not all packaged together, right messaging, right person, right timing, right content, right data and facts, you potentially could have problems.
Okay. So now I'm opening it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put in a couple question marks into the chat box, and I will call on you.